dedication to this hospital. In my first year here as CEO, I have quickly developed a deep respect for the rich history that Metropolitan shares with New York Medical College. Ours is an affiliation that dates back to our founding in 1875, representing the oldest partnership between a hospital and a private medical school in the United States. Today's event and many events that we've had here in this room are an example of the wonderful and strong bond that we share with New York Medical College. We have a full program, but I would like to acknowledge a few people in the audience. First, we are joined today by Dr. Alan Kadish, President of the Touro University System, and other colleagues from Touro, so welcome. My predecessor from Metropolitan, Mr. Anthony Rajkumar, is here as well, always supporting us from his sister hospital, Coney Island. And it's always a good day at Metropolitan when we're able to be joined by our former medical director, Dr. Richard Stone. Dr. Richard Stone served this hospital and this community as a physician and an administrator for over 40 years. And we're lucky enough to be able to have him serving as a member of our auxiliary board and continuing to provide service to Metropolitan in this community. We also have many members of our Chief of Services and our hospital staff here with us today, so thank you for joining us. At this time, I would like to introduce Rabbi Moshe Krupka, Executive Vice President of Touro College and University System, who will give a short story for us to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a short reflection as we start our program. So we're here to celebrate. We're here to celebrate the life's accomplishments and the legacy of Dr. Hinterbuchner and her husband. Celebrate the establishment that we share in their memory. We're here to celebrate the inaugural holder of that chair, Dr. Lopez, accomplished clinician and scholar. And we're here to celebrate the precious relationship that New York Medical College has with the Metropolitan, one that we value greatly. Rehabilitation medicine, people that are broken physically, broken in spirit. It's amazing how people could look at a deficiency, a handicap. There's a story told of a venerated king who was on his throne for some 50 years. It was his golden anniversary. And they decided to celebrate, and part of the celebration was to create this beautiful outfit and beautiful crown for the king. And they searched the kingdom to find the most incredible diamond to sit at the center of this crown. And they found the diamond. They brought it to the king, and everybody was gathered around. And the king was handed this box, and he opened the box, and the luster and the brilliance of the diamond was too much for the moment. He had to adjust his eyes, and his heart was racing at just the beauty, the sheer beauty and size of this stone, and then his heart sank, because going down the length of the diamond was this crack. The diamond was no longer perfect. And the king summoned all the advisors. What can we do? And the best they could come up with was to split the diamond right at the crack and have two stones at the head of the crown. And the king said, no, this is such a gorgeous diamond, you can't split it in half. Two halves won't make up the whole of this beauty. So one jeweler said, Your Highness, give me some time, be patient. Let me apply my trade, my science, my talents, and I promise I won't let you down. He gave him a room in the palace. They were trying to spy on him, but the jeweler wouldn't have anything of it, and said, just let me do what I do. You'll see, things will be good. Finally, he sent word to the king, I'm ready. And all of the advisors, the entire higher echelon of the kingdom was gathered around the throne as the king received this jeweler. He said, Your Honor, Your Highness, here is your diamond. He opened the box. Again, the brilliance was incredible. He was adjusting his eye and his heart was racing. He wanted to see what happened to that crack, to that imperfection. And then he finally saw what the jeweler had done. He was so satisfied and so happy because what was once a crack was now the stem of a beautiful rose that was etched into the face of this diamond. Ladies and gentlemen, rehabilitation medicine, all medicine, what we do together at New York Medical College, here at the Metropolitan, we sometimes encounter cracks and imperfections and disease. And together, we apply our scholarship, our science, our hearts and our souls to create the stem of something beautiful in people's lives. God should bless us with continued success in our collaborative relationship as we move forward together in the future. Thank you.
So I wanted to reflect a little bit about our position here within health and hospitals and who we are as a system. So most of you know Metropolitan serves many vulnerable New Yorkers, individuals and families that don't necessarily have health insurance or financial resources, some without legal immigration status, and patients who have nowhere else to turn in their time of need. The fulfillment of our mission could have not been possible without our strong partnership with New York Medical College. Together, since 1875, we have trained generations of doctors to meet the needs of our culturally diverse community. Our patients have been the primary beneficiaries of our close collaboration, often unaware of the academic stars who are overseeing their care. Our doctors are involved in leading important academic research, often at the forefront of developments in their respective fields, and sharing their immense knowledge here at the hospital. One of those stars is Dr. Eduardo Lopez. Dr. Lopez joined the faculty of New York Medical College and Metropolitan as Chairman and Chief of Service of the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine in 2012. As one of Metropolitan's centers of excellence, the department provides advanced health care to individuals recovering from cardiovascular conditions, spinal cord injuries, multiple trauma, neurological disorders, amputations, fractures, and other illnesses. Our multidisciplinary staff provides physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech and language therapy, along with other care providers. We offer services both in inpatient and outpatient settings. Our goal always is to help patients overcome the range of physical and emotional challenges they face in order to improve function and achieve a better quality of life. And very similar to what what Rabbi Masha said, really looking for that fine flower in that diamond. Under Dr. Lopez's leadership, the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine serves as the primary site of academic clinical training for the New York Medical College Rehabilitation Residency Program and students from the New York Medical College School of Medicine. This endowment solidifies the support for the teaching and training of medical students and residents. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Lopez on his appointment as the inaugural chair of the Catherine and Ladislav Hinterbuchner Endowed Chair in Rehab Medicine. And now I've asked Dr. Halpern to join me. We have a small token to share with Dr. Lopez.
For Dr. Lopez's remarks, we'll have greetings from the President of Turtle College and University System, Dr. Alan Kadish.
Thank you very much, Dr. Halpern, and President Moran. It was great to meet you. I'm going to be extraordinarily brief because my comments today are as much of a surprise to me as they are to all of you. I would echo what's been said about rehabilitation medicine, but I just wanted to add one or two things. I think what you heard talked about was skill and talent and science. What you didn't hear anybody say is how hard this really is. You know, in the field of medicine that I practiced in cardiac electrophysiology, we had patients, we brought them into the laboratory, we cured them, we put in a pacemaker, we put in a defibrillator, things were done, and you saw immediate successes. Rehabilitation medicine requires not just science, intelligence, medical training, but it requires humanity and perseverance. And that makes it a field of medicine for which I have enormous respect. One of my first friends, who was a physician, my first faculty physician at the University of Michigan, a man named Gary Davidoff, was one of the most caring people I met, who unfortunately passed away from Hodgkin's at age 40. But he exemplified the kind of dedication, talent, and commitment to patients, and commitment to excellence that rehabilitation medicine needs. I have to say that I have a lot of respect for people who are able to do this day in and day out, and we're thrilled, therefore, to have Dr. Lopez as the inaugural Hinterbuchner Chair, because from what I've heard about his work, he really exemplifies that kind of dedication to other people that really needs to remain the basis of medicine, even as technology changes, life science advances, CRISPR lets us edit genes. But without that humanity, we're going to lose the touch that's made Metropolitan medicine and New York hospitals so special. Welcome, Dr. Lopez.
Just going to have to remove this because it was pretty heavy. I won't end up with a brain injury, but definitely from strain. So, thank you, Dr. Kadish, and welcome to everyone. I feel an honor, this opportunity to be able to stand here before you, first to be recognized with this appointment as the first Catherine and Ladislav Hinterbuchner Chair. For many reasons. First, in reflecting, I have to think about the generosity of the donors and how am I going to continue this legacy of something which Dr. Hinterbuchner, who, you know, I met her once when she gave me a one-sheet page of the instructions of how a chairperson in rehab would be successful, and very appreciative I still have it, but at the same time of what this means in order of being able to make a donation like this to the School of Medicine, and specifically the rehabilitation medicine, specifically for education, and this means a lot for us which are in academia. With all these cuts, lack of resources, a generous donation like this just makes our work a little bit easier. That to begin with, working in the public health system is not the easiest, and we know well, my residents, some of whom are here, realize that sometimes we have to think out of the box because we don't have the resources that many other private hospitals have, or some of our patients who don't have insurance, but yet we want to deliver to them the best service possible in rehabilitation medicine. And that's what gives us the energy to wake up every day and come to the hospital and work with these patients, many of them who are going through a very difficult phase of their life now with a major medical condition, and trying to give them hope that there is something to look forward after they leave from here. So basically, I welcome everyone. I thank Dr. Kadish, Dr. Halprin, and all staff from New York Medical College for joining me this morning. And to my surprise, many of the old colleagues who joined us, some of our faculty, friends, and actually Linda, who I hadn't seen, she retired, who happens to be a very close friend of Dr. Hinterbuchner, shared many years working as her administrator, and was able to update me on the family and how her legacy from a different perspective, probably through recipes, continues. So as to say how complete and a full person Dr. Hinterbuchner and Ladislav were. So I decided to try to find a topic which was palatable from 12 to 1, and Dr. Halpin asked me, do I have any jokes? I don't have any jokes, but I did try to add some slides which should bring a chuckle, and I'll be able to wake up some of the people who are falling asleep. So I decided to talk about prevention because, again, this being a community hospital, a primary care providers, I think this is where we start. There's so much to talk about rehab, and specifically about brain injury, which is the area which I specialize in, but that would take, hours of conference, but I thought prevention is the best way to be able to learn a little bit about what I do and what our department does, and especially for all our guests to be able to learn something and be able to be educators moving forward. So basically, we know that traumatic brain injury is referred as a silent epidemic, and basically because traumatic brain injury goes from the very mild injury to where the patient gets traumatized and is able to recover fully, to a patient who actually is in coma. And the part which I want to emphasize today has to do with those mild injury which have these vague symptoms that are very easily overlooked and can have very big and severe consequences in the long term. And they arise from simple things as a fall, to a sports injury, to a slip, and definitely if we're not aware of this, there could be problems in the future for the patient and their family. The other part definitely has to do with these are conditions which are very difficult to diagnose unless you're really paying attention to it, because they don't show up in imaging. Many of these injuries are at the cellular level, the axon level, and so you're not able to do a blood test in a community hospital. You're not able to do an X-ray or CT or anything that's going to detect it. The other part definitely is that in terms of accidental injuries, being able to prevent this is definitely the ability to be able to save money in the long run, both for the hospital as well as the community. And the ones who basically are responsible for that are the healthcare providers, the family members. So we all play a very key part in trying to promote prevention. So basically, I'll just start by defining what's a mild brain injury. And basically, this is a definition by the World Health Organization and the Center for Task Force on Mild Brain Injury. And it's basically, it's an injury that results from a mechanical energy to the head, face, neck, or practically any other part of the body. There's patients who actually show up in the emergency room after an injury, and they present many fractures or other type of injuries, and they're overlooked. But someone who has this type of injury, chances are the brain has been shaken up in some way, and we want to make sure that we don't lose track of that. There's operational indicators to be able to define what's a mild, a moderate, and a severe brain injury. And basically these are based on the Glasgow Coma Scale, loss of consciousness, and amnesia. But again, I'm just not going to go into those details. And the last thing is you want to make sure that any patient who sustains an injury that we don't blame a brain injury as the cause of the symptoms, because we have to make sure there's not other types of medical conditions which could be producing these symptoms. Alcohol use, drugs. Sometimes what I find, even language barrier. If you don't have the right interpreter there, you might think the patient is having some aphasia problem, and it's basically just a language issue. The other thing is really related to the economical burden of brain injury. We're talking about $56 billion, which is the cost, and it's still increasing. Increasing basically because we're a lot better with EMS service, so a lot of these patients are surviving. A lot of them are because many of these patients, these symptoms are overlooked until later on when a construction worker, when he goes back to work, a student, when he goes back to school and starts demonstrating deficits, and everything that involves the parents or the support system having to stop working because of this. So basically, we're talking about a 1.4 million patients who experience traumatic brain injury. And again, we're talking about patients' data which is collected through emergency rooms and through states. We still know there is a greater population which is being seen by their primary doctors and are not considered within these statistics. But basically, this is what we work with, about 1.4 million, about 50,000 of those die immediately after the injury, about 250,000 require hospitalization, and approximately about 1 million of those are treated through the emergency room and then discharged. So we'll talk a little bit about what's the biomechanics of a head injury, and basically there's different components which lead to the type of brain injury that the patient has. Basically, as you can see, one has to do with the velocity. Do you have a pointer?
No, but make a note, Eduardo. We'll raise money for them.
So basically, we know that one of the things is the surface which the head impacts, but from the drawing, I also want to mention that for you to have a brain injury, you don't necessarily have to impact the surface. It could just be because of a sudden shake of the head. But basically, from the drawing, we know that velocity of the impact is one of the factors. The other is the surface which the head impacts, and the other is the motion of the head. And we know basically from the studies of Smith and Miene in 2011 that there's two types of acceleration. One is the linear, and the second one is the rotational. So in order to provoke or cause a brain injury of some severity, there has to be not only the acceleration linear, but also the head tends to rotate somewhat. And this is what, there you go. So we know that there is a rotational component, and usually this is the one that causes the majority of the injury. The surface, we know that the harder the surface and the shorter that impact period, chances are that there's going to be incredible stress on the skull, which eventually leads to fractures. And from there could also be then epidural hematoma, which is the most common. But we know that the longer duration and the softer the surface, which usually occurs when you're in a vehicle, that definitely then there is extra loading of the brain. And that's where you have some of these concussive injuries, the very severe or pathognomonic diffuse axonal injuries, subdurals, and other type of intracerebral hemorrhages. So how do you prevent that? So basically what we do know is vehicle designs. We have the new helmets which we have for brain injury. One of the things that we can't do is exercise the brain, right? So basically the only thing that you see in many of the sports that they do exercise is definitely some of the neck muscles, shoulder muscles, in order to protect his head. And we know that, again, there's usually accompanying injuries to the neck, spinal cord injuries with brain injuries, And it only takes about 30 degrees of the head to bend in that impact, enough to cause a spinal cord injury on top of it. That's why it's very careful, very important to protect the neck after specifically sports injury. So the only thing that works is prevention. And there's many things that definitely we could work to try to prevent, and there's other things we can't prevent. Military, war, brain injuries occurring at that time, sports, which we promote, again, as a way of being able to live a longer life, be healthier, but at the same time, there could also be the risk of injuries from sports injury. So basically, there's in the comprehensive programs, we try to consider two things. One is the passive perspective, which is from an engineering perspective. What can we change both on the road, helmets, in the car to make it safer to protect the passenger? And the other part is really our role as healthcare providers is really in the educational part. And sometimes we have to do a little bit more, which is we really have to legislate. We really have to join these grassroots groups to be able to promote. The National Brain Injury Association is one example, which has chapters in each of the states, which really advocate for these patients who have these type of injuries. They lobby in Washington and make sure that as we plan for healthcare changes, that we don't exclude these patients that require these type of care. So road design, from an engineering perspective, we know that increasing skidding surface of the road, which is something that's been implemented to very early in the 40s, started reducing some of the injuries caused by accidents. We know that basically the drop off once you get off the road, that you go to the shoulder, that incline itself was enough to be able to decrease at least a 6% of chances of car accidents. We know that the roundabouts, which eliminated a lot of the stop signs, and at the same time, I understand it's very difficult sometimes to figure out which side to get out, and your GPS is usually a few seconds behind, and you always get off. But definitely, that we know has also improved some of these. And the other thing is traffic calming. So basically, these are the islands, the median islands. This is all the road bumps, which we all get very upset because it slows us down. But these are all techniques which have gone into the designing of the road in order to make it safer for passengers and to reduce accidents. Seatbelts, which we know that since 1997 was pretty much enforced. And again, this is the 3 E's which I want you to remember, which is the engineering, the education, and the enforcement. Because many of these things, as you realize, and it is not until they started enforcing the use of seatbelts that we started noticing even greater decrease in the amount of injured passengers. So basically, it takes about 1 second for your airbag to deploy in order to permit that shock absorbing moment, and supposedly to allow you to still have some control to your vehicle. But once the airbags were added to the use of the lap straps and the shoulder belts, there's where we saw a very big decrease in the amount of injuries which were caused to the passengers. And also when they added in about 2004 the side airbags, definitely it added another 25% of extra protection from injuries which occur on that side. What we do know is that definitely something, for example, as an airbag, which was used to try to protect the passenger, was also a risk for children. And we know that the children died when the child was placed in the front seat. So that's where legislation came in, and children car seats were put in the back seat in order to protect them unless a specific weight were allowed in the front seat. So it is through legislation that we were able to further this. So motor vehicle accident is probably what you're more familiar with when we speak about traumatic brain injury. it's either motor vehicle accidents or boxing injuries are the two most things. And we know that the younger population is always the one who's at greater risk of being injured in a car accident. And fortunately, again, through prevention, through different type of driving schools, which are offered in different high schools for students, not allowing them to drive after certain time in the evening, and also being accompanied by something definitely has contributed to decreasing the amount of injuries that we do see. And definitely there are publicly funded efforts which are performed in order to be able to further enforce safety through the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration and the CDC. So here's one of the new ones that have been added to. So we know that driving under the influence of electronic device is now one of the big ones, right? So we know that at least now, statistically, at least 2/3 of the traffic accidents involve some form of use of an electronic device. And here again is where legislation, it's not enough for the parents or to tell their child, or a spouse to tell their child, don't text, don't pick up the phone. It all started first, it's okay as long as it was hands-free. And definitely we found out that no, there's still distractibility which occurs during this time. The average time that someone would be texting is about 10 to 15 seconds. So you could tell that there's enough time for things to really go wrong during this time. So basically it started with hands-free. We realized that that wasn't sufficient, and new laws have gone into effect now where basically, at least in at least 14 states now, you can't even get caught with a cell phone in your hands. That's enough to give you a fine, usually $150. It will be reported to your insurance, and then your second fine is about $300. It goes up from that. So laws are getting a lot tougher, but definitely that's the only way that it seems people and citizens are willing to change their behavior. So besides motor vehicle, we know that motorcycle accidents, and we have noticed there has been a decrease in the motor vehicle accidents, but there has been an increase in motorcycle accident, and this is pretty much added to the presentation for my colleague Joe Morales. So basically we know that there's been a staggering increase in motorcycle accidents to about 144%. And definitely the severity of the injury is even greater in motorcycles. And we know that the majority of them, if they do survive, they tend to have severe brain injury, contrary to some of the lower degrees of injury. We know from a preventive measure, we kind of focus on the demographics. Before, it was the very under 30-year-old population, which were at higher risk of being involved in motorcycle accidents. Now we know that it's the over 40. So that's now that population that we're concerned more about accident. And one of the things that we do realize is that one of the mitigating factors to try to prevent some of this has to do with the use of the helmet. But as for those who have been around for a while, you know, the 1976 during Clinton's administration, these laws were changed in terms of the obligating the states for drivers, motorcycle drivers, to have helmets. And basically what we've seen is that definitely the non-use of the helmet has actually caused increased accidents. It was repealed initially, and it was lobbied very heavily because there were some case reports which showed that with the use of helmets, they would end up with spinal cord injuries. And definitely that is true. There has been a lot of change in the helmets. But one of the things that we realized that's true to a certain perspective, but actually the benefits of and the protection it was providing was a lot greater. But again, you know, this goes into legislation. This goes into you know, these deals that the Congress has behind closed doors, and unfortunately it's not any longer in many states. There's at least 3 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and I'm going to say Michigan, that do not have any type of laws helmet use. In the other states, usually the younger population is required to have, under 18 has to use a helmet to be able to operate a motorcycle, but in some states it's very loose, the use of it. The other thing that has changed definitely has to do with the makeup of how the helmets are made. Basically a lot harder Kevlar type, stronger synthetic type of materials, and this definitely makes it a lot easier to protect the brain and the head. And for those who live in New York City and other very metropolitan cities, we have now the e-bikes that unfortunately you can get them on Kmart or order them by email. And basically these are motorized type of bikes which either operate on themselves or help you when you're pedaling. And basically it is a bike that does not require any type of title. It doesn't require any type of registration. You don't have to have a license to operate these bikes. The only requirements is that for it to be considered an e-bike, it has to run under 20 miles per hour. Anything above that, it's already considered a light vehicle, almost like a motorcycle, and then you do have to register it and all that. Basically, you have to be older than 16 years old, and the only other condition is that if you have had a DUI, if you get caught riding one of these e-bikes, you could also be ticketed and get an infraction for that. But other than that, it's very easy. But you can imagine the amount of danger which occurs when you see one of these motorcycles just riding on the bike lane at very high speeds, delivering food, right? And basically, it helps for delivery time, but definitely it's another vehicle of injury. The other one, which is concerning for us here in the hospital, definitely has to do the majority with falls. And basically, from an educational perspective, it's very important that we realize that once we know that a patient has fallen at least once, we should be already looking into this a little bit more. And usually most of the patients are just going to tell you, oh, it would happen to anybody. And there's many reasons why a patient could be falling, and we should be looking at that very closely. Basically, again, financial burden of falls, it's about $19 billion a year. And there's a bimodal distribution of falls. It's usually between the ages of 0 to 4. And then after 65 years old is the highest risk of falls. And we're talking about, this is about 40%, these two group population in terms of the falls. In pediatric population, definitely, the hospitalized pediatric population because of a fall is about 49%, and pediatric death from a fall is about 9%. In the elderly population, that definitely it skyrockets to 61% from a traumatic fall. And prevention definitely is what we would be looking for, and definitely prevention, which is usually comprehensive and usually involves a lot of different people in the care of that. I don't know if you guys recall, those who've lived in New York for a while, Children Can't Fly, which is what obligated because of the high percentage of children that were falling from windows at all these high rises, that basically putting a gate or locking those windows to a certain degree, that of itself decreased 96% of the deaths caused by this. So again, prevention and legislation is what is. Playground changes, playground changes are based on the size of the children, so they tend to be a lot, it's all focused on legs. In the majority of them, they're at very high risk of coordination because they tend to lack this, and so these are in height. So this is the area where playground changes have occurred with softer materials which protect the area where they're playing at. Basically, from an adult perspective, The 4 things that we usually look at when they do come in after a fall is definitely some type of hypotensive episode, polypharmacy, which tends to be 20% of the reasons why patients fall, especially the elderly, and especially when it has to do with sedating. And the other thing really has to do with the gait and balance, and this is where, you know, us as rehab physicians and our staff, therapists, work very closely. And basically, we do know that there's a reduction of the sensory cells, which give us information in terms of where we are in space, are reduced as we get older. So, you know, physiologically, there are changes that are occurring in our body that could explain why we're falling. So, you know, just saying that I fell, it would happen to anybody, is something that we really have to look much closer at. The other thing has to do with just, we tend to be a little bit less active as we get older, so there's more atrophy, there's more deconditioning, and all these things also lead to balance problems. Patients who have arthritis, our proprioception, which comes from, you know, our feet, our knees, is lost when we start getting arthritis. So all these things contribute to falls. And then the other part is the complicated. It's just the sophistication of the brain, and definitely is how the brain processes all this information from a proprioceptive perspective, from a visual perspective, from a vestibular perspective. And definitely we know that there is slowing in that integration system, and definitely all that contributes to fall. The environment, you know, in the hospital we have skid socks in order for patients not to slip, but it's the same thing at home. Environmental changes, removing different rugs from different areas, especially the throw rugs, which patients can easily slip. You know, protective bars in the kitchen or in the room, in the bathroom also will help improve and decrease the chances of fall. And at least from a clinician perspective, you know, just taking the time to what we call just a quiet standing evaluation of these patients who have fallen, and that's enough to be able to give you some information. The Rombergs and other type of tests, which are a little bit more sophisticated, but even just having the patient stand up 30 seconds and see what happens when the patient goes in. But there's many other type of evaluations and tools which we could use, and definitely with referrals to us or different physicians who deal with the elderly population. It's a lot. One thing is that there is no standard physical therapy program specific for each patient, for every patient. These are pretty much specific. So based on the changes that I mentioned previously, you know, is it a weakness problem? Is it an endurance problem? Is it a balance problem? You know, is it a blood pressure problem? All these would play into the type of prescription we would write for somebody who has some type of therapy. But definitely, you know, the basic ones are really just strengthening the patient again, you know, vestibular system, and definitely enhanced proprioception. So, contrary to this first part, which I spoke to, we speak about sports, which is one of the things which is supposed to enhance and supposed to make us better and supposed to help us live longer. But we know there are some risks involved with sports. And one of the things that we do know that cardiovascular, we know that exercise from the brain's perspective, we know that loss of brain volume decreases with that. You have better cognition. You have decreased chances of dementia. You have also the neurodegenerative. So there's many benefits from exercise, but we know that there are some risks which are involved with the different type of sports. But what's most important is that, as we've seen during the past few years, there has been a growing awareness of some of these risks of each of the sports, and we've found preventive measures to be able to help in avoiding some of those consequences, the sequela from sports-related injury. And you've probably been hearing a lot in the news lately. There was an article just recently published in the JAMA related to chronic traumatic encephalopathy related to football players and definitely these are kind of the catastrophic results of practicing a sport, but I'll try to deal with it pretty much on the lighter side. So basically from, as you see, the statistics are pretty different from the ones I gave you initially, where I said probably 1.4 million people suffer traumatic brain injury. This is pretty much just sports related. So this is from different type of studies which have been done, and we know that it's a lot higher, the amount of injuries to the brain secondary to sports, and most of them are related to a concussion. And as I mentioned, most of these concussion has to do because the neuron, which is the cell of the nervous system, tends to stretch with these type of injuries. And a neuron could resist up to 60% of the stretching and goes back to it. And with the stretching, you'll have changes at a cellular level, you have changes probably at the membrane, changes, chemical changes, and depending on the severity and how much of that elasticity occurred is what the residual consequences are going to be. Again, prevention is what we're promoting here, definitely through education to coaches, education to the athlete's family. Cycling, to begin, we're talking about what we have, about 51,000 accidents related to cycling, and we know this is 2009, we know this is probably a lot higher, given that many of the big cities now have bike lanes and making it a lot easier for people to ride bikes, but at the same time adds pretty much more danger. We know that the younger population is definitely the one who tends to be most affected and definitely a little bit more devastated in the children because of just their developing brain. Helmets is definitely here. The use of helmets being promoted. Again, you know, the tougher the laws are, the less are the chances of these injuries. But we do know that the use of helmets helps decrease bicycle accident fatalities by about 85%, and decreases the injury being a severe traumatic injury by about a 75%. So basically, this is teaching the cyclists, educating the cyclists that they have to obey the laws, they have to stop at the stop signs, they have to stop at the lights, and use bells in their bikes and lights at night in order to protect them as well as children. So if there's one sport that's we immediately think about traumatic brain injury, has to do with boxing, and we know that earlier in the 20th century, where boxing was beginning to be very popular, the careers of boxers were a lot longer. Now we know that boxers nowadays, the most they'll be practicing the sport is about 5 years average, given the consequences of the injury. And basically, it's very hard to prevent injuries from boxing because the main goal is for you to be able to knock out the other person. So that makes it a lot difficult from that perspective. But definitely one of the things which has helped is practicing with helmets. The other part definitely has to do with the enforcement of anyone who's presenting any type of symptoms, which there is some type of fogginess or alteration in mental status, is removed from the fight, as is with many of the other sports. So if boxing wasn't devastating enough, so now we have the mixed martial arts, which now not only do they hit with their hands, they can also kick towards the head and causing greater damage to the brain. Definitely, one of the things that they do say that contrary to boxing, there's other parts of the body which they can aim for, so usually there's less chance of a concussion compared with a boxing, but they use lighter gloves. So if you have lighter gloves, it's going to hurt you a lot more when you hit your opponent, so you're not going to try to use your hands too much. So they tend to use their legs and with much greater forces and chances of creating greater damage. American football, definitely, you know, our national sport. Again, as I mentioned before, 70% of the fatalities which occur from football have to do with inappropriately tackling and chances of brain injuries, and its association now with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So the NFL, basically what it has done, there's some safety rules, and for those who do follow football, you know, some of the major changes are during a lot of the practice, they don't use the helmets. That way, you know, they're not bumping heads or any of this, then they tend to protect them. A lot of the training in colleges also requires them to keep their head extended without helmets in their practicing. The other part is the return, as the ball is kicked and you're receiving, it's requiring 5 yards further just to give extra time for the opposing team to get the ball and not be tackled immediately. But definitely, I think the biggest thing that has occurred is, again, it's this removal of the players once they suspect that there has been some change in their mental status. And the Lestat law, Lestat was a 13-year-old high school football player who actually continued to play after a devastating blow like this, and ended up with a very severe brain injury. He survived, still has some problems with speech and coordination, but from this devastating injury, then laws was implemented, and it's practically in all the states, and the NFL also follows it in terms of removal from the game of any player who has these changes. The other part that was also part of the law is education of trainers, coaches, is required to identify these players who might be presenting with a concussion. Soccer, well above 265 million participants internationally in the use of this game. Definitely, one of the questions which has also arisen is that the heading, which causes heading of the ball, what causes, and you know, the jury's still out, but definitely this isn't the main reason why they believe these athletes get these injuries. The younger the athlete, they're going to be they're going to have weaker muscles. We know that that's why there's a higher incidence in females, just because of the body makeup. But it's not particularly the heading. It usually is contact with other players. It's usually, you know, contact when the ball is heading towards you at very high speeds, which provokes some of these injuries. And definitely, we tend to see them less in the more experienced players than in the younger players. And basically, a lot which has occurred is, you know, the use of helmets while they're practicing. The soccer ball also has changed. It used to be out of leather, which once it got wet, it was even heavier and causing. Now it's definitely out of synthetic material that's waterproof, so this has also helped with this. And basically the return to play. So these are pretty much just guidelines in terms of it. It usually takes about 6 days after you've identified someone who could have a sports-related concussion before you can return that athlete back to play. And first of all, it does require a specialist who deals with concussion to be able to clear you to go back to play. And basically, it's a day-to-day. First of all, you have to be totally asymptomatic. After that, you allow them to go back to practice their sports, but without any type of contact. And then you just allow him to go back to the regular sport with his team, not against the opposing team. And if at any time during those 6 days that you're trying to return the player back, he starts showing symptoms, then you kind of have to keep him in that state before you're allowing him to be able to go back. And we talk about not only the cognitive part, but we especially in students, we try to also parallel this with how their performance is at school, how they're doing in school. So we wouldn't clear somebody to go back to sports unless we're seeing the same thing happening in school. He's keeping up with his homework, he's keeping up with the tasks that have been assigned, and not noticing that one thing is lagging the other, because then you should not return the patient back. From a hockey, definitely there's a lot of body contact here, a lot of checking here, and we know that in hockey, for example, male versus female, in female hockey, they do not allow any type of checking, which is just your body coming into contact with the other person in order to not allow them to advance. We have a less chance of concussion in the female population. So we know that checking is a very big part of the body contact which occurs. Some of it is allowed, usually below the waist is allowed, and usually we won't see much of this happening, but anything above that has its consequences. Basically, laws have been added. NHL has added laws where now you can't, if you're hit on the head by an opponent, either with the stick or with the body, you get a penalty. And the other thing is there's now what they call a fair play scoring system, where not only do you get points for the good plays, but you also get points if you do not cause any type of injury or cause any of these different type of injuries against the opponent. So just in brief, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, as I mentioned, basically the last study was this year, and it just speaks to about 200 football players, anywhere from high school to professional football players, who said upon their death they would donate their brain for study. And for the first time, there has been some pathological findings specific to patients who have chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And basically, what we do see is that you have these paired helical filaments, tau protein deposits in specific areas of the brain, specifically the frontal and temporal, and usually on the bottom of the sulci is where they tend to accumulate, as well as the TDP43. Basically, with this information, again, they're donated. It's a population that was at high risk. There could be many other factors why, which could have contributed to this, including use of drugs, use of alcohol. But definitely, we do know that this is kind of the first study that really speaks to a link between the participation in the sports and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So it has raised the bar in terms of holding responsible many of these sporting clubs in terms of protecting their athletes. So, basically, I think we have advanced a lot in terms of the health of the brain and realizing when things do to damage. The issue is that the hard part is being able to reverse, as you would reverse hypertension with antihypertensive medication. So given that we have not reached that point yet, prevention still stands as our strongest tool. So, thank you.
Members of the clergy, Ms. Moran, Mr. Raj Kumar, officers of the hospital, officers of the college, ladies and gentlemen, we are the beneficiaries of a lot of caring and hard work to bring us to this day. And I ask the following individuals or groups of people to stand and remain standing so we can acknowledge them all together. Any members of the Board of Trust of the Hinterbuchner Trust or of the will, may I ask them to rise. May I ask the members of the search committee for the Hinterbuchner Endowed chair to please rise. We have several here. If there is a Congressional Medal of Honor to be given for documentary paperwork for an endowed chair. It ought to go to Vilma Bordenaro. Amy Kahn and members of the development staff of the college. Noel from the communications office from Metropolitan and your colleagues. Jennifer Reichert and her colleagues from the communications office of New York Medical College. Thank you to all of you. Friends, I'd like to conclude our formal program this afternoon by thinking with you for a minute about why are we really here? Why are we really all here in this room right now? We are in part here because 100 years ago this year, a bespectacled, high-pitched voice political scientist who believed very much in the power of the written and spoken word, never used a speechwriter, and believed in personally appearing for Congress to make his point, named Woodrow Wilson, on April 2nd, 1917, told the joint second session of Congress, "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for things which we have always carried nearest our hearts. For democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make this world at last free. Launching the United States into World War I and causing the carnage in the trenches of France made American and British medicine come to grapple with massive needs for rehabilitation and gave birth in the United States and England to a new class of healthcare providers. The United States and Britain, being a group of people separated by a common language, had trouble trying to figure out what to call these people, and we had new words added to the English language: physiatrist, physiotherapist, physical therapist, rehabilitation medicine doctor, physical medicine doctor. We are here because of the development of this specialty of medicine, very much as a result of war. We are also here because President Wilson repetitively encouraged immigration to the United States. He vetoed at least 3 bills when the Congress tried to restrict immigration. It was his successor who acceded to those laws, but an attitude of openness towards immigration led to the acquisition of enormous talent in this country, including Catherine Hinterbuchner, came to this country as an immigrant. We are here also because she cared deeply for her discipline and reached across the barrier of death to promote her discipline. We are here because Eduardo Lopez has devoted his life to this discipline of medicine. We are here because Metropolitan Hospital is a teaching hospital where the generation and conservation and dissemination of knowledge finds a home. We are here because, as Olina said, New York Medical College and Metropolitan have been brothers and sisters since 1875. We are here because on behalf of the college, I gave my word of honor to the trustees of Dr. Hinterbuchner's trust that we would fulfill the instructions of her trust. And I submit we are here most importantly because we know who we are and where we stand, and we shall not be moved. This hospital does not look like a glass and chrome palatial Hyatt Regency, a look which seems to be the aspirational goal of many other hospitals on this island. This hospital is here because we don't care where you came from, because we don't care how hard it is for people like me to pronounce your name, because we don't care how much money you have, because we don't believe that there are good or bad immigrants, and because we do not believe that any human beings should be called illegal. There are no such things as illegal human beings, there are only human beings. We are here because we think that there are human beings who need an extended helping hand in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine of New York Medical College at the Metropolitan Hospital, and we are very proud of what we believe. My youngest daughter told me when she was a little girl that if something really good happens and you don't say a blessing, Dad, it's kind of like stealing. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who gave us life, who sustained us, and allowed us all to reach this day. As we say back home in North Carolina, you all know that's right.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and please enjoy the food in the back if you haven't had a meal yet. Thank you.
How are you? You drove? Yes, I drove. How are you? Oh, okay.
We decided to have some lunch together.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. Very nice. Okay. You kind of catch up to spring.
Always a pleasure. Oh, thank you.
It's pretty almost out before.
I clean up after myself.
Excited to. Good. For your midnight. Very impressive. For you. Good job, guys. Good job.
We should get some.